A letter arrived at the Vatican in the third week of February 2026. It was not a long letter. Father Davide Pagliarani, the Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X, had chosen his words carefully. There was no rage in the text, no bitterness, only a calm, absolute finality. The Society, he wrote, could not continue dialogue with Rome on the terms that had been proposed. They both knew, he said, that doctrinal agreement was impossible, particularly regarding what had happened to the Catholic Church since the Second Vatican Council. And then came the line that shook Rome to its foundations. The episcopal ordinations, Pagliarani wrote, would proceed on July 1, 2026 at Écon, Switzerland, without a papal mandate, without Rome's permission, exactly as Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre had done 38 years before on June 30, 1988, the day that broke the Catholic world in two. If you have been watching this channel and you have not yet subscribed, take a moment to do that now and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. This community is growing and we want to hear from you. The letter landed on the desk of Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, and within days Rome had issued its response. The Vatican statement, published May 13, 2026, was unambiguous. The planned consecrations constitute in the Church's formal language a schismatic act. Those who participated, the consecrating bishops, the priests receiving the consecration, would incur lata sententia excommunication, automatic, irreversible unless lifted by the Pope himself. The Vatican had spoken. July 1 had become a deadline and the clock was ticking. But before Rome issued its formal decree, something else happened, something no one had quite expected. Three voices rose from within the Church itself, voices that belonged not to progressive cardinals eager to discipline traditionalists, but to the very men the faithful of the Society of St. Pius X most admired. Men who had defended the traditional Latin Mass for decades, men who had crossed swords with modernists inside the Vatican, men whose credentials among conservative and traditional Catholics were beyond question. These three men looked at what the Society was about to do and said, with sorrow and with love and with absolute theological conviction, "Do not do this, you must stop." The first voice belonged to Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Müller. Müller is German. He was born in 1947 in Mainz, ordained a priest in 1978, and appointed Bishop of Regensburg in 2002 by Pope John Paul II. In 2012, Pope Benedict XVI called him to Rome and named him prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the same office once held by the Inquisition, the office that for centuries had been entrusted with guarding the doctrinal integrity of the entire Catholic Church. Müller held that post until 2017. He has never stopped speaking. In the weeks following Pagliarani's letter, Müller gave an extended interview to the Catholic Herald that was published under a headline that carried the weight of the moment: "The Church and the SPX, Cardinal Müller on a tragic conflict." The word tragic was Müller's own, not scandalous, not rebellious. Tragic, because he understood both sides. He had spent years studying the theological wounds left by the Second Vatican Council. He had watched the traditional Latin Mass be restricted, then partially restored under Benedict XVI, then restricted again under Francis. He knew the grief of the traditionalists. He had shared much of it himself, and yet Müller's verdict was clear. He wrote that the Society of St. Pius X saw itself as a holy remnant, the faithful few who had preserved the true church while millions of others, including bishops and priests and popes, had succumbed to modernism. Müller understood this self-understanding. He did not dismiss it as mere arrogance, but he saw in it something that, taken to its conclusion, would destroy the very unity the Society claimed to be protecting. The Church, Müller insisted, cannot be reduced to a faction. The Church is not a subset of herself. The Church is the whole body, gathered under Peter. On the question of the consecration specifically, Müller's language was precise and unsparing. "No one," he wrote, "has a right to episcopal consecration, which belongs to the Church and not to individual groups, in order to guarantee the continued existence of its organization according to purely human rights." Read those words slowly. They are not bureaucratic language. They are a theological declaration. Müller was saying that episcopal succession, the chain of ordained bishops stretching back to the apostles themselves, is a gift that belongs to the whole Church, not a possession that any group can seize for its own survival. To consecrate bishops without the Pope's mandate is not a neutral act. It is a claim to a power that does not belong to you. Müller went further still. Writing in Catholic World Report just days before this script was completed, in a piece published June 7, 2026, barely 3 weeks before the consecrations, he asked aloud whether schism was truly in the air. His answer was yes, he believed it was. He grieved it. And he stated with complete clarity that the only path forward in conscience before God was for the Society to recognize Pope Leo XIV, not merely in theory but in practice, to submit to his teaching authority and his primacy of jurisdiction without conditions. Not after the Pope changed his positions, not after Vatican II was revised now, unconditionally. The second voice belonged to Cardinal Robert Serra. Robert Serra is from Guinea in West Africa. He was born in 945 in a small village called Aurus, the son of a poor family who became Catholics in a region where Christianity was new and fragile and costly. He was ordained a priest at 24. He was appointed Archbishop of Conakry at 34, the youngest bishop in the world at that time. John Paul II made him a cardinal. Benedict XVI made him prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, which is the Vatican dicastery responsible for the liturgy of the entire Latin Church. From that position, Serra spent years fighting, quietly at first, then openly, to preserve the reverence and the beauty of the Mass. He wrote books that sold in the millions. He spoke of the crisis of silence in the liturgy. He warned that a church that worshipped carelessly would soon believe carelessly. Among the faithful who loved the traditional Latin Mass, Cardinal Serra was a hero. And so when he took up his pen in February 2026, the Society of St. Pius X listened, even as it rejected his words. Serra's appeal was published in the French weekly Le Journal du Dimanche on February 22nd, 2026. It was measured, it was sorrowful, it was, in many ways, heartbreaking to read. He began by declaring his deep affection for the tradition the Society had preserved. He did not come as an enemy, he did not come to condemn. He came, as he said, in profound sorrow, expressing what he called his grave concern over the announced decision to proceed with episcopal ordinations without a pontifical mandate. He wrote, "I wish to express my great concern and my profound sorrow upon learning of the announcement by the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X, founded by Archbishop Lefebvre, of its intention to proceed with episcopal ordinations without pontifical mandate." Then Serra turned to the Society's justification, the argument that the salvation of souls required these consecrations, that the priesthood of the Society would die without them, and that this supreme necessity overrode every canon and every papal command. It was, in essence, the same argument Lefebvre had made in 1988. Serra engaged it directly and tenderly. "We are told," he wrote, "that this decision to disobey the law of the Church is motivated by the supreme law of the salvation of souls. But salvation is Christ, and he gives himself only within the Church. Obedience," Serra argued, "is not the enemy of tradition. Obedience is how tradition is transmitted. Disobedience to Peter," he wrote, "is disobedience to Christ." The Society responded to Serra within days. Father Pagliarani's organization published a formal reply acknowledging the Cardinal's authority and his record in defense of tradition and rejecting his appeal. The consecrations, the Society said, would proceed. The third voice belonged to Cardinal Joseph Zen. Zen is different from both Müller and Serra in one crucial respect. He did not simply ask the Society to stop. He acknowledged, openly, on record, that the Society's dilemma was genuine. Zen is the retired Archbishop of Hong Kong. He was born in Shanghai in 1932. He was a Salesian priest who lived through the occupation of China, witnessed the Catholic Church in mainland China, driven underground by a communist government, and watched as faithful priests were imprisoned for refusing to submit to a state-controlled church that answered to Beijing rather than Rome. Zen knows what it costs to hold the faith when an institution demands you betray it. He has paid that price himself. In March 2026, Cardinal Zen published a statement in Italian on his personal platform, titled simply "The Case of the SPX." It was unusual. It compared the situation to the biblical story of Joseph and his brothers. Fernandez, the Vatican doctrinal prefect who had issued the excommunication warning, Zen compared to Joseph's brothers. Pope Leo XIV he compared to Reuben, the good brother who sought reconciliation. And the Society of St. Pius X he compared to Joseph himself, misunderstood, cast into a pit. eventually vindicated by Providence. But Zen did not excuse the society from its obligations. On the contrary, he stated plainly that a schism must be avoided with every effort because it will cause serious and lasting damage to the church. He called on the society to trust Pope Leo XIV. He wrote that the Pope understood what had been done wrongly in the name of the so-called spirit of the council, things that had contradicted genuine Catholic tradition. And he urged the society to wait, to trust, to believe that the Pope would bring correction from within, rather than forcing a rupture that would wound everyone. 3 cardinals, 3 different temperaments, 3 different continents, 3 different paths through the church. One shared conviction: this must not happen. Now pause for a moment and consider what is actually at stake. The Society of St. Pius was founded by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre in 1970, in the turbulent years after the Second Vatican Council. Lefebvre was a French missionary archbishop, a man who had spent decades evangelizing in Africa, who had trained hundreds of priests, who had served the church with absolute devotion and genuine distinction. He watched the changes that followed Vatican II, and he believed with the certainty of a man who had lived the old church, that something essential was being lost. The new Mass, introduced in 1969 under Pope Paul VI, troubled him deeply. He continued to form priests in the traditional rite. Rome grew impatient, the tensions grew. In 1988 came the rupture. Pope John Paul II had offered Lefebvre a path, a partial agreement, signed by both Lefebvre and Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Benedict XVI. It was a fragile accord. It would have allowed the society to regularize its canonical situation while preserving the traditional Mass. For a few days, it seemed like peace was possible. Then Lefebvre changed his mind. He withdrew his signature. He announced he would consecrate 4 bishops regardless of Rome's refusal. On June 30, 1988, at Écône, the same seminary where the 2026 consecrations are planned, Lefebvre consecrated bishops Bernard Fellet, Bernard Tissier de Malleres, Richard Williamson, and Alfonso de Galarreta. The Holy See's Congregation for Bishops declared that all involved had incurred automatic excommunication, the wounds of 1988 never fully healed. Pope Benedict XVI lifted the excommunications of the 4 bishops in January 2009 in a gesture of mercy and reconciliation that opened years of theological dialogue. But dialogue stalled. Agreement on the legitimacy of Vatican II proved impossible. The society remained in what the Church calls irregular canonical status. Present, active, administering sacraments, forming priests, operating schools and chapels and monasteries across the world, but technically outside the full juridical communion of the Catholic Church. And now, in 2026, the question has returned. The 2 bishops who remain from Lefebvre's original consecrations are elderly. The society's leadership concluded that without new bishops, the priesthood of the society would eventually extinguish itself. No bishop to ordain new priests, no priest to offer the Mass, no Mass to sustain the faithful. They announced they would consecrate new bishops on July 1, 2026, again at Écône. 38 years almost to the day from the original rupture. Rome said no. Cardinals Müller and Serra and Zen said, please do not. Father Pagliarani read their words. He considered them. He replied with respect and with grief and with the calm, implacable conviction of a man who believed he had no other choice. What strikes the thoughtful Catholic observer, what should strike any person of faith who follows these events closely, is the profound tragedy embedded in this entire situation. None of the men involved are monsters. None of them are cynics. Müller spent decades inside the Vatican's doctrinal machinery and emerged from it more committed to orthodoxy, not less. Serra gave his life to the Church in one of the poorest corners of the world and rose to defend its liturgy from a position of real power. Zen endured harassment and trial and the hostility of a powerful government and never once wavered in his fidelity to Rome. Pagliarani leads an organization that has formed thousands of priests who believe they are serving God in the most reverent way possible, who offer the Mass as it was offered for centuries, who have never stopped praying for the Pope even while defying him. And yet here they stand, on opposite sides of a line that July 1, 2026 may make permanent. Cardinal Müller used the word tragic. He was right. In tragedy, the forces in conflict are not simply good against evil. They are 2 forms of fidelity in collision. The Society of St. Pius X is faithful to a tradition. Rome is faithful to a structure. What Müller and Sarah and Zen were saying, in their different ways, is that tradition cannot survive the destruction of structure, that the sacred liturgy is not a private inheritance, that the mystical body of Christ, as Cardinal Sarah wrote, cannot be torn apart without bleeding. There is something in the timing of all this that asks to be held quietly in the heart. Pope Francis died on April 21, 2025, after a long papacy that both wounded and stretched the Catholic Church in ways that historians will spend decades unpacking. On May 8, 2025, Pope Leo XIV was elected. Robert Francis Prevost, an American Augustinian, a man many Catholics did not know, and whose name carried the weight of prophecy for those who remembered what St. Malachi had written centuries ago. Leo XIV inherited a church already stretched by liturgical conflict, by the German synodal path, by debates over doctrine and discipline that had been running since long before his election. The SPS crisis was waiting for him on the morning after his white smoke. He has tried to reach the society. Cardinal Zen's statement was clear that Pope Leo XIV sought reconciliation, that he understood the legitimate griefs of traditional Catholics, that he was not making this his first battle. But July 1 is coming, and Father Pagliarani has said that he cannot wait. What Cardinal Müller said in his final public words before the deadline, in the interview published just days before the consecrations, was this: the real issue at stake is not the traditional Latin Mass. It is not liturgical aesthetics. It is not the disputed paragraphs of Vatican II on religious liberty. The real issue is whether the Catholic Church is one holy Catholic and apostolic in any meaningful sense, or whether any group that believes itself to possess the true tradition may simply constitute itself as the Church, appoint its own bishops, and operate independently of Rome. If that principle is accepted, he argued, the Church ceases to exist as the Church. It becomes a federation of communities, each claiming authentic succession. That path leads not to the preservation of tradition, it leads to its fragmentation. 3 cardinals begged the rebels to stop. 2 of them had spent their careers defending the very tradition the society claimed to preserve. 1 of them had suffered for the faith in ways few Catholics in the West can imagine. All 3 of them were listened to and thanked and declined. July 1, 2026 is very close now. The outcome will shape Catholicism for a generation. It may shape it for much longer than that. Whatever happens at Econ on that day, the faithful deserve to understand what led to it, who stood up and asked for another way, what was said, what the Church believes about unity and succession and the authority of Peter. This is not a story about politics. It is a story about what it means to hold the faith when you believe, with all your heart, that the institution entrusted with that faith has failed it. That question will not be resolved on July 1. It has been asked for nearly 2,000 years, and it will be asked long after all of us are gone. But right now, in these final days before the deadline, 3 voices echo across the Church and across history. 3 men who loved the tradition. 3 men who saw where the road was leading. 3 men who said with sorrow and with love and with everything they had, stop, there is still time. Whether time was enough is what the whole Church is waiting to learn.